Welcome back to another lecture on Africa. Last time we talked about the scramble for Africa, which is the beginning of wide-scale European colonization in Africa, or really exploitation of Africa in this particular case. Today we're going to talk about decolonization. Now, on one hand, decolonization, from an American perspective, is a positive thing, because a deeply held American value is the right for people to determine their government for themselves. This is written into our very Declaration of Independence, our very Constitution, and it's something that American presidents have long believed in and have long advocated for. Both Woodrow Wilson and Franklin Delano Roosevelt advocated strongly for this in both world wars. And while I have my many problems with Woodrow Wilson, and I have several problems with FDR, I certainly agree with their commitment to this principle, that people have a right to determine their own government, their own rulers, their own leadership. Strongly believe in this, and I think most Americans do. If you're in the minority, that is a surprise to me, but I think most Americans would agree with this. So, in general, when we hear decolonization, the democratization, or the nativization of Africa, we should, in general, say, yes, this is a positive thing. The Africans are having the ability to control Africa. Unfortunately, the management of decolonization oftentimes let African states in an incredibly poor situation, not only because they had been exploited by Europeans, but the boundaries that had been drawn by the Europeans for their colonies oftentimes became the borders of nations that contained hundreds of different people groups who for thousands of years had been rivals. It artificially changed languages, it artificially changed ethnicities, it just created an immense mess that, to be frank, is still sorting itself out to this day. The most recent major African change that has occurred well within your lifetime, in fact, at the time you've been in high school, was the official separation of South Sudan from Sudan, which, I mean, you could think of it as North Sudan, but its name is Sudan, which back when I was still in high school was a single country undergoing a 18-year-long civil war. I think by the time everything was said and done, the nation was finally split in half, not peacefully by any means, but it was. So we're still, even today, seeing the results of a poor process of decolonization. And really, by the way, I don't think there's a lot of good examples of decolonization in the past. You know, typically colonies end in one of two ways. The native people throw the colonizers out, such as, you know, the American Revolution and the South American Revolutions. Or the Europeans leave and the nation more or less sorts itself out with a little bit of conflict, or it doesn't sort itself out and there's huge amounts of conflict. Britain in India is an example of fairly good decolonization. There are many things that it could have done better, and it could have treated India a lot better during its colonial era, but still India survived as a state fairly intact. Okay, so as far as decolonization goes, that's about as good as it gets. Africa, on the other hand, is a huge example of how this oftentimes goes very poorly and does not work out well at all. So let's talk about decolonization. First off, let's be clear that the late stage of European colonization in Africa was primarily for resource extraction or resource exploitation. And I say exploitation, by the way, not just, although I think it does have a little bit of this, not just in the sense that they're taking something and they really shouldn't, or they're taking something and they're not giving anything back, like, you know, like exploiting your little sibling for their candy, you know, by telling them something and then they give it to you and then you don't give them anything in return. That's kind of what we think of as exploiting, and I do think there was a little bit of that going on with the European nations, but exploitation itself simply means the extracting and use of resources from the ground. So there's significant resource exploitation in Africa, and this is what the European nations are primarily interested in. Remember, we talked about the difference between settlement colonization, where people go and they create farms and they create European-style societies, and most of Africa, remember, did not support this kind of colonization. Instead, we have people going and making fortunes off the natural resources in Africa itself. That's what's going on. So we have this going on all across Africa. We have this going on under English rule, French rule, Belgian rule, German rule until they lose World War I, Spanish rule, Italian rule. All of these nations are using colonial systems to extract resources. And there's a serious problem with this, because oftentimes what happens is those extracted resources are enriching the mother country rather than the nation from which they're coming. So let's just use the Congo as an example, because we'll be talking about them extensively in the next lecture. The Congo had huge, and does actually have huge, resources in almost every metal useful for industrial society. And what would happen is that metal would be mined. Copper was one of the most famous mining materials brought out of the Congo, and especially as the electrical revolution was going on, copper became very important for wiring. So this copper would be extracted, and laborers would be paid, sometimes more often coerced, as free slave labor, and that copper would be extracted. But rather than enrich the Congo itself, rather than improve the situation of the people that were mining the copper, instead all of the profits would go into the hands of wealthy Belgian overlords. And that money would usually be sent back to Belgium. So Belgium was improved by this labor, this use of manpower, and the natives really didn't enjoy anything at all. Even if they had been paid very fair wages, this might not be the case. But the reality was they were being exploited. They were not, and I mean that in the true exploitation sense. They were being used, they were working, and they were getting very little of value for what they were doing. And this is true all across Africa. We just used the Congo as an example. The Europeans were extracting resources and doing very little to improve the lots of the native Africans. Now, this is not true for everyone. In fact, there were many Europeans who cared, and for the most part, these Europeans were primarily missionaries. There were several missionary societies who had a very vested interest in improving the lives of average Africans, and I think there is some light there in European involvement and Christian involvement in Africa, but the governments themselves were primarily concerned with extracting resources for two reasons. Number one, the government back home, especially in Europe, was very, very cash-strapped. I mean, there are a lot of expenses for fighting world wars, for dramatically expanding production. Many European nations between 1919 and 1939 were expanding what we today call the welfare state. In other words, a type of arrangement where the government takes care of almost all of your physical needs. It gives you your health care, it gives you your housing, it pays for food to some extent, it pays for all of your education, not only your primary education, but also your secondary and even tertiary education. Tertiary education meaning college. This is going on in Europe, and this is fantastically, prohibitively expensive. And eventually in 1929, we have Great Depression, and then everybody's cash-starved. And so this extraction of resources is occurring, and the colonial offices in all of these colonies need to send the money back home, and they need to make their own budgets. Many of these colonial operations were not being funded by their home governments. They had to make enough from what they were doing to keep everyone employed and keep them there in the first place. So there's this incredible pressure on the governing groups of each of these colonies, the governing Europeans, because they needed to produce large amounts of economic resources, or else not only would their colony be shut down, but the mother country was oftentimes relying on the very wealth being extracted to continue to run in a normal way. And you can argue that that is wrong, or you can argue that that adds more nuance to what was going on, but simply the fact remains that there was a reason that the European nations were extracting resources from these nations so heavily. Again, does that make it right? No, it does not make it right, but that's what was going on. After World War II, the world order changed, and I mentioned this near the end of the Scrambled Africa lecture, where we talked about the fact that the Soviet Union and the United States emerged as the most powerful nations in the world. And unlike their European predecessors, they were not going to tolerate the continued abuse of African peoples by the Europeans. And the Soviet Union, of course, wanted the opportunity for the Africans to pick communism. The United States, again, as I mentioned, really strongly supported the idea of people's right to decide for themselves. And in fact, President Roosevelt in 1941, after joining the war, told Winston Churchill that one of his important policies, one of his important desires for the war, is that people all over the world have the right to self-determine their government. That's his exact wording. And of course, many in the British Empire were very ecstatic about this, especially India, which had been fighting hard for its independence for a number of years. They basically saw this as the death knell of their subservience to the British. Okay, the Americans are coming in to help with the war, but the price for them coming into the war is the British have to let go of some of their possessions. And that's exactly what happened after the war. A Labour government was voted in. That Labour government knew which way the tide was going and finally let India go. kind of like the pharaohs of old. They finally figured out that, hey, we're going to need to do this or there's going to be big consequences, so we'll let India go. So pretty much every European nation was on notice. You are going to need to get out of Africa. And the United States and the Soviet Union would prefer sooner rather than later. And in fact, we see that the longer it takes for European nations to leave Africa, typically the worse the situation in the countries they leave gets. And this is certainly true for places like the Belgian Congo and for Angola and Mozambique, some of the most war-torn regions in the entire planet. The British tended to have a more successful track record in most of their colonial possessions, with the exception of Rhodesia, modern-day Zimbabwe, and South Africa itself, which are stories that we will tell near the end of this lecture. Decolonization generally, at least in principle, was supposed to involve the transition of European government to African government. What this would involve is the slow transition of voting rights to all Africans, the transition of leadership positions between Europeans and Africans, and the transition of armed forces between Europeans and Africans. Because typically in a African colony, all of the governmental leaders were white, and all of the army officers were white, and the only people who could vote were white. And Africans, could serve in menial labor jobs. They could serve as grunts in the military, but not as leaders. And they might be able to serve as secretaries in the governmental positions, but they didn't really have the opportunity to really get to know the jobs. And the idea was, at least in principle, that this transition period would involve Africans and Europeans slowly exchanging their roles, and the Europeans leaving as they, are phased out. If you want to think of it in a car analogy, those of you who have a car with a clutch, it's kind of like slowly easing off the clutch and pushing down the gas pedal, right? Think about you're very slowly trying to get out of first gear. The idea is that you're letting up on one while increasing the other. You're letting up on the amount of whites involved in governing, and you're increasing the amount of blacks involved in governing. Unfortunately, this often did not work out particularly well. In fact, most of the time, once the Europeans were physically exhausted from attempting to transition, they would just wipe their hands, kind of dust their hands off like this, and go, you know what, I'm out of here. I'm done. I am going to leave, and you Africans, good luck, because I hope you know what you're doing. And what happens is that Africans get thrown into a bunch of things, and there's mass chaos. And unfortunately, when there is mass chaos, there typically is one group above other groups that is able to kind of come to the forefront. And African leaders were not prominent in businesses. Most of these businesses were owned by Europeans and either left with the Europeans or were left in very chaotic state. The government, while there were a number of Africans who had gotten educations in the United States and Europe, when they came back, they found out that teaching people who for the last 1,000 years hadn't even had a system of writing, the whole concept of democracy is difficult, right? It takes time to teach them these things. But there was one group that did enjoy a lot of organization and success, and that was the military. Military is something that is almost universal in human cultures. Almost every human culture develops military strength. And many of these African regiments had trained extensively, and while they were not officially allowed in leadership positions, many African warriors quickly rose up the ranks, and so the military ended up being the only organization after the Europeans left that had any structure to it. And this allows the leader of the military oftentimes to install himself as the leader of the entire nation. If you have ever wondered, why is it that African nations seem to be dominated by generals who become presidents so often, or rebel generals that become presidents so often? That is why. Because the political experience of Africans is very low. Again, the elite has experience, they've been trained, but the average African citizen of each nation has very limited exposure to democracy. It's simply not something that they've been exposed to. This doesn't make them less intelligent. This doesn't make them less suitable for democracy. They simply don't have the experience with it. And instead, they have a strong colonial power replaced by a strong African local power that has no more interest in teaching them about democracy than the colonial power did. Because the dictator can effectively stay in power by his armed forces. He doesn't need the people to vote for him. And so many of these unstable African nations end up with military dictators rather than functioning governments. And this happens again and again and again and again. These nations have complex civil wars that usually end up with a new dictator on the throne, and it seems as if nothing happens. And this happens very, very frequently, and all across Africa, unfortunately. And many African nations, by the way, are still dealing with these situations. Even up to this day, they still have military dictators that are causing serious problems for them. Now let's talk about some of the real problem children. We're not going to talk about the Belgian Congo today because we're going to spend an entire lecture talking about the Belgian Congo. So I don't think that's necessary since we'll spend plenty of time there. Instead, let's talk about some of the other failed states, or states that had significant problem in their development. First, let's talk about the two Rhodesias. And I say two Rhodesias. You won't find any Rhodesias on the map today. If you buy a National Geographic 2020 atlas, there is no Rhodesia to find. The two Rhodesias are modern-day Zambia and modern-day Zimbabwe. These were both colonies established between the First and Second World War by European settlers coming up from South Africa. And they settled in this region of Africa, which again has fairly fertile farmland, depending on what you're growing. They settled there, and they kind of took over the locals and ruled kind of as a ruling elite. The locals would work on their farms and fields, and they would kind of rule the countryside. It was almost like a feudal Europe again in these areas. Well, with decolonization in full swing, Northern Rhodesia eventually decided to put away this old white management strategy and instead institute a democracy. And today Zambia, at least from a democratic point of view, has been a fairly high-functioning democracy for most of its history. It has its share of problems, but again, with the circumstances that Africa went through, this should not be surprising to us at all. On the other hand, the southern part of Rhodesia, or just Rhodesia proper, modern-day Zimbabwe, had enough military firepower to really push back on this idea of democratizing. And so in the 1960s, the Rhodesian government, the white government, effectively outlawed blacks from holding government positions. They purposely kept blacks down, again, very similar to apartheid in South Africa. And over the next 20 years, we have a war between the Rhodesian military and black liberation armies that are attempting to put African Americans in charge and establish universal manhood suffrage, or universal suffrage in some cases. The problem with all of this is when the Africans finally get into power, they begin to take resources from the whites, and rather than redistribute them to all blacks, which again, is redistributing resources right? Well, that's a hard question, but at the same time, what right did the Europeans have to those resources in the first place, right? This is a complex question. But rather than redistribute resources to everyone, as they had originally promised, these leaders instead redistributed resources to their close friends and personal allies. So effectively what happened in Rhodesia is there went from a white ruling class who controlled most of the wealth of the nation to a black ruling class that controlled most of the nation. And unfortunately, this black ruling class was primarily made of former rebel soldiers. And while they're good at fighting, they're not good at managing. And eventually, the entire economy of Zimbabwe collapsed. You can go online and buy $1 trillion banknotes from the Bank of Zimbabwe, and they are literally worth less than the paper they are printed on. People would literally have to carry around trillions of dollars to buy bread. Okay, it simply got ridiculously unvaluable. And Zimbabwe still has major problems. And many of those problems stemmed from the taking of these farms from whites and redistributing them to Native Africans. And again, because these Native Africans were just buddies of the guy in charge, oftentimes this land was mismanaged, and the natural resources available to Zimbabwe really aren't being put to good use. And by the way, South Africa is struggling with this right now. With the fall of apartheid in 1990, most white farmers were allowed to keep their land, but there is discussion now in South Africa of reparations, white farmers being cast off of their land and that land being redistributed to blacks. But again, the problem is that land going to be utilized? Because perhaps there is a moral argument to be made, whose land is this? I mean, I can certainly tell you from a historical perspective that it was not being cultivated in South Africa when the Europeans took it over. But perhaps the Africans who lost the ability to use that land do deserve something in return. But just turning it over to Africans who don't use it certainly is not the correct solution. And so these things are complicated, and they're things that these decolonized places have to work through. We also have a number of civil wars. This is particularly true in Angola and Mozambique. These are controlled by the Portuguese all the way until 1975. So some of the last European areas to be decolonized. And because of this slow decolonization, there is a growing movement contingent of communists supplied by the Soviet Union that are going to break out in both Angola and Mozambique. And that's when Portugal finally decided to leave. And so you effectively have some Angolans and Mozambikers that believe in democracy. You have some that believe in communism, and you, of course, have a civil war brewing. And Angola and Mozambique held the very dubious record of being the most landmined countries in the world for almost 40 years. Unfortunately, Afghanistan, I believe, has recently passed that number. Definitely not the statistic that you want to be number one in, but this just shows some of the problems that decolonization created and some of the political instability created. Now the question is, do the Europeans owe these African nations support now? And as an American, I think I probably have a biased view towards this. In fact, I would say that many European nations do owe some African nations some support, at least from an educational point of view. Some nations do this better than others. Britain and France have done a fairly good job at supporting their former colonies through education, through use of military force. France specifically, in many of its former colonies, is willing to aid them in anti-terrorism and things like that. So I think these European nations do owe these African nations some support because they are partially responsible for the current state that they're in. But I would also like to point out that the Europeans badly botched the decolonization process. And perhaps if the Europeans had had the political will and the stubbornness to stay in Africa for another 20 years and transition power rather than simply dump it in Africans' laps, we might have a much more vibrant and economically viable Africa than we do currently. Now, that's not to say that there's not hope for Africa. Again, the Africans are just as capable as any other human beings, but again, they are working against huge disadvantages. And over the next few decades, it's going to become clear, or one way or the other, whether the Africans are going to be able to overcome some of their problems and rise above them and create well-functioning democratic societies, or whether they're going to continue to be dominated by military strongmen. Either way, as Christians, hopefully we can realize that the decolonization of Africa has caused a lot of pain, but it's also created an opportunity to reach people and show them Jesus Christ. Because again, Africa is in turmoil. Things are changing. People are moving. Industrialization is occurring. People are moving out of the bush and into cities. And as things transition, hopefully the name of Jesus Christ enters those places as well. Next time we'll study the Belgian Congo as a case study and really think about what occurred there. We'll do some outside research to understand better how the Congo occurred and how it was mismanaged. And that'll be the topic of our next lecture.